50 years ago, Nick Mackenzie worked on a U.S. Forest Service trail crew. He learned through grueling manual labor exactly what it takes to seat a single heavy stone into a dry-laid retaining wall so that it sheds water, holds the grade, and survives decades of winter frost and heavy boots without cracking. When you hike past one of these walls on a Trans-Sierra trail today, the tight, mortarless masonry makes it look newly built, but it was laid over 90 years ago by an agency that no longer exists. The Civilian Conservation Corps applied this same standard of labor to 3 billion trees, over 800 state and national parks, and tens of thousands of miles of trails across the American landscape. Yet despite having a massive physical footprint you can still walk across today, and despite being a cornerstone of the New Deal, Congress quietly starved the CCC of its funding in 1942. Curious, analytical, they built a permanent physical landscape, but they failed to build a permanent institution. It raises a question: how a program with this much physical reach and public support could be so easily erased? In the spring of 1933, roughly a quarter of the American workforce was unemployed. Franklin Roosevelt entered the White House with a firm conviction: idle young men and neglected public lands could rescue each other. He asked Congress for the authority to create a conservation work corps. The legislation moved through both chambers in a matter of days, and Roosevelt signed the Emergency Conservation Work Act on March 31st. What followed was a rapid deployment from a standing start. The very first enrollee walked into a CCC camp on April 7th, just 37 days after Inauguration Day. By July, the government had successfully deployed 275,000 young men into the woods, ready to work. Moving that many people that fast required a massive logistical shortcut. 4 cabinet departments ran the program together, but Roosevelt handed the heavy lifting, housing, feeding, and transporting the men, directly to the War Department. Because it turned idle youth into visible, lasting public goods without offering a handout, the CCC became the most broadly supported program Franklin Roosevelt ever built. The exact logistical shortcut that made this 37-day launch possible, relying on the military to administer a civilian workforce, planted the seed of its eventual destruction. The Army's deep involvement created immediate political friction. William Greene, the president of the American Federation of Labor, emerged early as one of the program's loudest critics. Organized labor had 2 specific objections. First, they worried that putting military officers in charge of civilian camps would lead to the forced militarization of American youth. Second, they feared that having relief workers build infrastructure for $30 a month would undercut the wages of skilled tradesmen. Roosevelt knew these political enemies were waiting. To shield the program from them, he went to Congress in 1937 and formally requested that the CCC be made a permanent federal agency. This chart tracks the CCC's physical lifespan against its legal existence. Congress restricted the CCC to a temporary charter tied to the Depression. Permanent agencies require a public vote to destroy. A temporary program dies automatically when its extensions run out. By existing only on fragile paper rather than permanent statute, the country's most admired program was left completely exposed. If the definition of the national emergency ever shifted, the CCC would vanish. That shift arrived in 1942. When the United States entered the Second World War, the economic emergency that justified the CCC's temporary charter disappeared entirely. The peacetime draft pulled eligible enrollees into uniform, while booming defense plants offered real wages to men who had previously relied on a $1-a-day relief stipend. The work camps emptied faster than they could be filled. This demographic collapse gave the CCC's old enemies the exact opening they had been waiting a decade for. Fiscal conservatives and organized labor finally had the leverage to move against a weakened program. But Congress never held a highly publicized, politically risky vote to officially abolish the program. They didn't have to. Because the agency was temporary, Congress simply let its appropriation lapse in mid-1942. They quietly starved the agency of its operating funds, providing just enough money to liquidate the camps. Which brings us back to Nick Mackenzie at the wall. The physical craftsmanship of the enrollees was so robust that their switchbacks and retaining walls are still holding the mountain together 90 years later, long after the federal agency that ordered them evaporated into thin air. Broad public support and massive productivity can build a legacy, but they are entirely useless at protecting a government program if you fail to encode it permanently into law.